Hi, welcome to the video explanation of Assignment 1. Now, Assignment 1 is an annotated lesson plan, and it is 50% of your overall mark. Now, one of the things that we will try to do both online and in the face-to-face tutorials, and I'm working on now trying to make sure that the face-to-face tutorials are recorded. But what we'll do is we'll try to make sure that we're incorporating activities that really help scaffold you in creating your lesson plan. And I'll tell you about some different resources available to you. So this lesson plan is due on the 26th of August by 5 minutes to midnight. So do keep that in mind. I think it's always really good to think about when your assignments are due and work backwards and decide, what you're going to have done by a certain point in time. So the first thing that you must do in this task is prepare a detailed lesson plan for a 45 to 50-minute lesson that you will teach in your chosen teaching context. Now, the lesson plan format is on Moodle, and we'll also talk more about that in week 4. Now, talking about your chosen teaching context, this could be, your teaching context that you've just come from, or your future teaching context. So really think about where you would like to, but also make sure you're thinking about creating a lesson plan that is that you're able to use. So if you're going to invest all the time in creating this, let it be a very significant and special lesson plan that could actually be used and possibly in the future be used as an example for other teachers. A big part of this lesson plan is not just creating the lesson plan, but including annotations, and that's really kind of explanations of why you're doing things. So it's kind of allowing the reader, allowing the marker to kind of get in your head, well, why did you choose that activity? What was the reason behind it? Why did you use this particular strategy or resource? So it's being able to discuss, and I'll show you the template and where you might do that, in backing up those reasons why you decided to design it the way that you did. So, why did you use group work? Well, maybe because you feel that that students have an opportunity to negotiate meaning and interact, and that then strengthens language ability. So these are things that you need to annotate or discuss throughout the lesson plan. And there will be a space where you can do that, and you can also create other spaces if you'd like throughout the lesson plan. Also talk about why you will do it. So again, I mentioned, so how does this connect with the literature about what's good practice, and really looking at your context. So in the first week, a lot of students talked about, for example, in China, where students focus a great deal on things like grammar and reading and writing, and not so much speaking. And part of that is because of the high stakes exam culture. So, providing that and saying, well, the reason why I'm focusing on this communicative task is because students need more time and experience in these communicative tasks. A really important thing is talking and annotating about how the lesson is linked back to an assessment outcome from a curriculum framework. We'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through this video. But really, finding a curriculum framework should be one of the first steps that you take. Support your annotations with links to at least 5 academic references. Now, what's important here is these are academic references in addition to the prescribed unit readings. So you can use the different readings for the class, whether that's Harmer, the textbook from Harmer, or the various PDFs that you can access on Moodle. But the idea is that you need to then find an additional 5 academic references from outside of those prescribed readings. So you might have 2 or 3 that are specifically looking at kind of the conditions of teaching within your teaching context. So if you're looking at China or wherever, so really looking at that. And then you might use some other readings that kind of, you get an idea from the textbook from Harmer, and then you look at some of the additional readings that you can use. Now you need to include all your teaching materials in the appendix. So if you decide to use a worksheet or anything like that, you can use that in the appendix. But the important thing is that this lesson needs to be original. And this is really important because a lot of students think, well, I can just take a lesson plan and change it a little bit. really you are creating a lesson, and you can use some materials to support that, but it does not shape or dictate your lesson. You can incorporate materials, but your lesson is actually it is completely original that you've made up. And you can include some resources, but they are supplementary. They are not the main idea of what you're teaching. So here's just a few of my suggestions in approaching it. We're going to go through the rubric and also the template in a minute, but these are just some suggestions. The first step should be find a curriculum framework. And in a few slides, I'll show you some different frameworks. You may have a curriculum framework from your own country, or you may decide to use a Victorian or Australian curriculum framework. And there are certain ones for languages, and there are certain ones that are specifically for English as an additional language. So you need to kind of look at that curriculum framework, because in a lot of these things, when it talks about an assessment outcome, it's best to start from the curriculum framework, identify an outcome or an assessment outcome. Now, I'll give you the example of the Victorian curriculum. The Victorian curriculum is set up in content descriptors, which describes what you should teach, and then assessment outcomes. And the assessment criteria or outcomes are different, and they're kind of worded as students will be able to. Now, what I would do is I would use that, and I would use those for my objectives, because then I know it links directly to the curriculum framework, and I know that's what they're expected to do in the curriculum. So when you're thinking about the curriculum framework, look at what the assessment outcomes are, and then use those to really influence your objectives. And the other thing is you need to consider the class context. So who are the students? You know, how old are they? Are they in a particular year group? Do they come from a certain background? Are they homogenous or, you know, from diverse backgrounds? How much English, you know, what is their level of English? What is important for them to learn? So maybe this is where you say, well, these students have never had any formal or explicit teaching in regards to reading. You know? So, you know, why is that important? When talking about the level that they are, you can use different frameworks. So there's Common European Framework Reference for Languages, and I'll show you an example of that in a minute. Or there may be specific levels that are indicated in the curriculum framework that you can use to say, well, the students are at this particular level. Of course, then we also have kind of more general things like beginner, intermediate, and so on, but that might need a bit more explanation. So sometimes it's nice to have a framework to say they are at this particular level. Now you need to create objectives or goals or aims, but again, I would say that you really need to connect these objectives very closely with the curriculum framework. From the point of view of teaching EAL in Australia, one of the things is that parents, in particular, when you're reporting back to them, they want to know, as far as the curriculum, where is their child at? So it's really important to always kind of be able to link back to the curriculum framework, and that's good for accountability for your principal or, you know, your team leaders to say, I have been following the curriculum framework, but also, you know, and it gives that structure to the lesson. So make sure that the objectives match what they need to learn. And then you can, once you've kind of identified the curriculum framework and the objectives that you want to focus on, then you can identify a theme or topic that kind of encapsulates that. You know, it could be something really broad like Australian animals, or it could be, you know, science experiments or anything like that. But I would start first with objectives and then kind of identify a theme or topic. Now, I'm going to go through some of these aspects in a bit here from the template, the lesson plan template, but there's a section where it talks about an introduction. Now, in the introduction, you might talk about, well, what problems does this lesson address? Is this lesson plan addressing a particular problem? And this may link to a broader context. So, you know, going back to the idea of you're from China. In China, this is one of the problems that many students who are learning English face. So you can, and then you can draw from some of the literature. So you can do that within your introduction. The other suggestion is to make sure that you check your work and turn it in. In the past, there have been some lesson plans that have had identify that they've taken some, copied and paste from the internet or online. And this is part of Monash policy, is that it's very strong in regards to plagiarism. So do make sure, because sometimes people do this accidentally because they haven't referenced correctly. So do make sure that you put your work in to turn it in, just to make sure that, because if it has been plagiarized, you can fail. So, if you have any questions and you are concerned that there may be issues, do come and talk with your tutor, but just use Turnitin to kind of check for similarity. Now, I was talking about the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages, and this is an example that they have A1 to C2, where it's basic user, independent user, proficient user. There's some links on this to the webs in Moodle, but also in this PowerPoint. So that can give you an idea of where the student is. Some curriculum frameworks. This is also posted in week 4 in the post class. So again, actually the Common European Framework for Reference of Languages also has its own kind of framework. So here you can use that, as well as the Australian curriculum in regards to languages. In Victorian curriculum, there's also the AusBells EAL curriculum that you can use, and then this other CSWE resource. So, and of course you can look at, if you are from a different country, you can look at a particular framework from your country, but you do need to make sure that you include which framework you used. So obviously not all, as tutors, we won't be able to understand all frameworks. So maybe if it is a framework that's not commonly known, putting an example of the curriculum framework within your appendix would be really helpful. So here's the annotated lesson plan template. Now, again, you have the topic and theme, you have the introduction, context, and so on. Now, again, you don't have to do this, you don't have to create it in this order. As I mentioned, I think one of the first things is looking at the curriculum framework and identifying what the assessment outcomes are. So what is the actual assessment outcome? Then you can fill these things out. The context. I think the difference between introduction and context is the introduction might, talk about why you decided to do this particular lesson, where the teaching context looks more at the profile of the student, so more about the teaching context, where the introduction might give a broader context of where things sit and why you've chosen to do this particular lesson plan. Language level I mentioned before, so are they beginner, or are you using the Common European Framework to discuss where they're at as far as their language level. Class size, that really does impact. I know I lived in Vietnam for a while, and a lot of the classrooms are quite large, and that really does impact how you would structure a lesson. So if, for example, you said the class size was 50, and you said you were going to do individual presentations in class, well, you know that wouldn't work, because how would you have enough time to do that? Or you'd have to realize that the sound is going to be an issue. So maybe some of them might go outside. These are all things that you would have to kind of discuss. Sorry, just going back, also this previous knowledge and skills. It's really important to talk about what have they been working on, what's been taught before, what previous knowledge do they bring in. So for example, if you were talking about Australian animals, do they have any previous knowledge of this? Have you worked on different noun groups? What have you actually worked on to kind of help them prepare for this lesson? Now this next part is you have the communicative goals or objectives, and then the linguistic goals and objectives. In week 4 we talk a little bit about, some people use aims, goals, and objectives interchangeably, but they are a little bit different. When I think of a goal, it's a bit more broad, or an aim is a bit broader, but an objective really starts with students will be able to, so on. So it's an outcome. This is what the students can do at the end of the lesson, where a goal might be that they will write an article. If I was going to change students write an article for a class magazine to an objective more specifically, I might write something, at the end of this lesson, students will be able to write an article for a class magazine. So some of that is a bit of structure. So there's the communicative side. So what will students do with the language that is taught and practiced? And then there's linguistic goals, which is more about language structures. So just because it's a communicative task doesn't mean you're not also focusing on linguistic objectives. So it might be grammar or vocab. So there might be a vocab list, words that you might be discussing and reviewing and so on. Or it could be a genre. Maybe you're doing something on narratives or storybooks. So you're really looking at how once upon a time fairy tales, they have there's certain features of this particular genre of fairy tale stories. Or there's grammar. There's a particular grammar focus. So there's the linguistic and the communicative, and you should have both. But I wouldn't try to do too much. So one for each is fine. Now, if you feel that you can do more, you can, but again, the more specific and really structured that the lesson is, the better. So maybe one communicative objective, or two if you feel you need to, or linguistic objectives as well, one or two. Now, assessment strategies. Now, we will talk kind of later on in the unit about assessment more specifically, but here is, how do you know that students have learned what you're trying to teach them? So what will you do? Are you going to be taking notes, anecdotal notes, watching them work in pairs and how often they discuss something, or how often one initiates a discussion and how often someone includes another person? Or it could be, there is a more formal assessment task. Maybe they have to write something and then it's assessed. Maybe you're going to incorporate peer assessment strategies where students look at other students' work and assess it, or self-assessment. Maybe there's a checklist that you use to see if they have grasped the main objectives of the lesson. So, but what is the evidence that you have to suggest that students have learned? So talk about how you are going to assess the students and then be able to assess whether the lesson was actually successful. What materials and resources? This includes any kind of handouts. It also includes any online. Maybe you want to show a clip to a video. You need to include that, what video you're using and why. Board organization. How will you use the whiteboard or whichever board you have? I remember I used to put just a few things of what we were going to do in the day so students could see the main ideas of things that we were doing. I might use the board to write a sentence on the board and get students to analyze the sentence in what it was trying to, the meaning that it was trying to convey and the structures that were there and so on. So how we use the board. So you need to discuss that as well. Now so that's kind of the back, these two first pages are the background, giving an idea. And then you have the actual procedure. Now here we have, again, you'll need to put, again, the objectives. So I would say that you shouldn't have more than 4, but ideally 2. Okay, so you should have a communicative and a linguistic. But the idea in a 45 or 50-minute lesson plan to do a variety of objectives is quite hard. So maybe have 2 objectives, one communicative, one linguistic. So here's where, and again, timing does kind of, it can be difficult to organize time, but I would organize, the time that you have for each stage or activity. So maybe the first stage is kind of a warm-up or giving, some kind of activity to kind of get them engaged. What are the language skills they're using? Are they reading? Are they speaking? What sorts of skills are they using? What is the teacher doing? What is the learner doing? What is the model of interaction? Is it just the teacher talking, or is it the students talking to each other, or is it pair work, so on? And what materials or resources do you need? Are you using the board? Are you not using the board? Are they working on a particular photocopy of something? What kind of materials and resources are needed? And so there'll be each kind of stage or activity that you'll discuss through here. But here's really talking about the activities and the strategies that you will use. Now there's this section here that says anticipated problems and solutions. So for example, if you did an activity when using the internet, for example, and the internet's not working, what are you going to do? What could happen? Because technology is a lovely tool, but sometimes it doesn't work. What might you do instead? What's the backup plan? And then there's a section reference and rationale. So if you are using a warm-up activity, Why did you use that warm activity? What was the reason for that? And how does that connect to the literature? What does the literature say about using these kind of warm-up or introduction types of activities to get students engaged in the start of the lesson? Now, you might find that you want to talk about the anticipated problems and solutions and the rationale for each activity. So you can obviously change this template to do that after each activity or after a few. So how you organize that is up to you. Now, there are quite a few resources available to you. This is a little screenshot from Moodle, and it talks about the assignment 1 Dropbox, so that's where you put your assignment. There's Turnitin for your draft 1 check. Now, don't put it into Turnitin and think it's submitted. You get the results from that, and it looks at similarity. I think if there's a high percentage of similarity, then you need to go back and check to make sure that you've referenced correctly. But after you've done that, then you put it into the Dropbox to be submitted. In the assignment 1 guides and resources, there's the lesson plan template, there's a variety of different things. There's a student sample. Please look at the student sample, that will give you some ideas. Also, in the face-to-face and online activities, we'll do some more work in looking at some samples. And also the rubric is there. There will also be handouts in week 4, handout 1 and 2, that can also help you start thinking about how to organize your lesson plan. And you don't need to worry about uploading PowerPoint, because for this assignment, you wouldn't do it on PowerPoint. Now, I wanted to just quickly go through the rubric, because it's really important to understand, both as a student and a teacher, that the rubric is what we are assessing the work on. So it's good practice to go through the rubric and self-assess yourself. Have I actually met the criteria? So I'm just going to go through this. So the criteria is word length. The word length is 4,000, and you have a bit of breathing room, less than 10%, over 10% of 4,000. Make sure that you use APA. Go to the library in a drop-in session if you're worried about that, or but make sure that you are referencing correctly. One of the criteria, and this, as you see from these 4 criteria, has double the points of the other 3. So clear rationale has been provided, including a thorough overview of the context and an explanation as to why the assessment outcome has been chosen. So I've kind of looked at 3 different sections of the lesson template where you might do this. The introduction. Why has this assessment outcome been chosen? Why are you focusing on this particular lesson? Why are you using this lesson? What is going on in the broader context, as I mentioned earlier? What is your personal philosophy, and how does this impact on how you have designed this lesson? So maybe you've decided that you really feel that you need to focus on speaking in authentic context, so you've used role plays. Well, why did you do that? Why do you think it's important? And maybe it's because you personally have had your own experience of using role plays, and then it was a really helpful strategy or technique. Teaching context. In the teaching context, you're talking about what is the teaching context is like, what is the student profile like, as I mentioned before. And then giving a rationale. I would suggest maybe for each stage or every couple of stages, why did you choose the teaching strategies or the activities that you did, and how does this connect to the literature? So this is a really important part, so make sure you spend quite a bit of time on this idea of rationale. So that would include sections like the introduction, teaching context, and rationale for each stage of the lesson plan or lesson plan procedure. The third criteria is a clear statement of the relationship with other lessons, and student knowledge and skills is included. Clear communication and linguistic goals. So previous and future learning, making sure that you explain what students have done before and what they're expected to do in future lessons. And so where does this lesson fit in? How does this lesson actually fit and help that bigger teaching and learning cycle? Looking again at your goals and objectives. Linking back to the assessment outcomes for curriculum, students will be able to do what as far as communication goes and linguistic skills. The fourth criteria is looking at a clearly stated learning focus including resources to be used and how the board will be organized as included. So as I mentioned before, we have the resources, which you put in the appendix. What resources are you using? And then the board, how it will be used. Are you going to use a video and put it up on the board? Pictures. Maybe you'll put the stages of the lesson that you have to give your students a guide of what you will be covering in that particular lesson. The fifth criteria is a clear explanation of how learning will be monitored is provided. So how will you assess what they have learned? What evidence do you have to suggest they have met the objectives? Thoroughness and clarity of procedure based on well understood principles of language learning are achieved. So does it flow logically? Have you incorporated principles of learning? So if have you focused on guided yet explicit instruction on form? And why have you done this? And that's where it kind of links to the rationale. But if you have said that you have 50 students in your class, again, this is where you probably wouldn't get as many points if you decided to then do individual interviews with each student during class. It's not going to happen with 50 students. There's a flow to looking at, well, now they've been able to be introduced to some concepts or ideas or structures, and now they get to practice it. So looking at Harmer's suggestions of how you might present the material. Do you use the PPP? So you present information and you practice it. How have you decided to structure things, and that there is some sort of logical procedure? And that you're linking back in that rationale to link back to say, why did you use groups? Why did you decide to work independently here? Why did you choose particular activities? And this is all part of, explaining that rationale as well. The other thing is, did you incorporate a review? So maybe you actually review some of the concepts that you had mentioned in that they had previously learned to kind of then connect them into this new lesson. Anticipated difficulties. So I mentioned this before. What happens if the internet is down? What happens if you use a running dictation and someone gets hurt? Just some things that you could imagine happening, and ways and strategies to think about how to overcome them. And then language. Make sure that you check the language-rich rubric in the assessment resources to make sure that you have organized it clearly, you have structured it well, and that you have provided, checked for grammar and spelling mistakes. Now, this is out of 50 points. So HD is 40 to 50, D 35 to 39, and so on. Now, this is my last point that I want to make. Sorry this is so long, but I think that it's really important to understand. I think everybody wants to get an HD. I would have been the same. You want to do well. All of you have come into this course because you're high achieving students. And I think that it's important to understand that not everybody will get an HD, and that doesn't mean that you haven't done the assignment well. Because really, if you look at HDD, CP, C is the standard. It is you have done everything that you have needed to do. D is you've done it really well. HD is that if I was going to give out a sample as this is an example of a perfect, amazing lesson plan, it would be an HD. HD is an exemplary. It is an example type lesson. So we don't give HDs out, I guess, that generously. And of course, if you have created the points to get it, and met the criteria, yes. But I think it's really important to understand, both as a student and as a teacher, that assessment is about learning. We hope that through this particular assessment task, that you will think through some of the processes that you need to go through when you lesson plan. Why am I doing this? What is the context? How do I meet students' needs, and so on? So you think through all of those things that will then help you in the future create really strong lesson plans. So the idea and the purpose of this lesson, or this assessment task, is to learn. It is not to get an HD, it is to learn. If you finish this and you've learned something, well done. And that's where that plagiarism comes in. If you copy something, you haven't learned anything. The idea is that you learn from this. And you as a teacher, you as a student, I have teachers that, may have gotten P's, pass on assignments, but they are excellent teachers. So know that this is not a complete reflection of who you are as a teacher, but it's an opportunity to learn through the process of assessment. Thank you for listening. Hopefully this was helpful. Please make sure you bring any questions to your tutor, both online and in your face-to-face tutorials. Thank you. Bye.